Welcome to QuaVerTV. This is Genius. I am QuaVerTV today. We are talking about Nate Dogg, holy voice, dirty words, the voice that shouldn't have made sense, but changed everything, and maybe just maybe the crossroads where it all began. I was scrolling through my feed the other day and came across this reel that stopped me dead in my tracks. One of Nate Dogg's people, I can't remember if it was Warranty or someone else from his circle, was talking about how Nate reached this breaking point in his career where he didn't want to do full verses anymore, didn't want to be treated like a complete artist anymore. He just started saying, "Here's my price for the hook," and that's it. Take it or leave it, because he realized something that broke his heart. Nobody was really listening to what he had to say as an artist. They just wanted Nate Dogg, the hook machine, the guy who could take any song and make it feel soulful and smooth, even when it was talking about the grimiest, most violent street life you could imagine. But here's what got me thinking even deeper about that story, and this is where it gets mystical, where it gets spiritual, where it gets downright eerie. You know, where Nate Dogg learned to sing, where his voice was first shaped, where that holy sound was born in his chest, Clarksdale, Mississippi, at the Lifeline Baptist Church, where his father, Daniel Lee Hale, was the pastor, and his mother, Ruth Holmes, led the choir. Now, if you know anything about music history, about blues history, about the very soul of American music, then you know exactly what Clarksdale, Mississippi represents, because that's where the Crossroads are. That's where, according to legend, Robert Johnson sold his soul to the devil in exchange for supernatural musical ability at the intersection of Highways 49 and 61. So picture this young Nate Dogg growing up in the same town where the most famous musical bargain with the devil supposedly took place, his father preaching salvation from the pulpit, his mother leading souls in worship, and all around him the echoes of Robert Johnson's guitar, the whispers of a man who traded his eternal soul for the ability to make music that would live forever. And maybe, just maybe, young Nate absorbed more than just gospel music in that town. Maybe he breathed in something deeper, something that would later make perfect sense when you hear what he did with his voice. Because when I heard that, it hit me like a punch to the chest. It took me all the way back to the first time I really heard Nate Dogg, not just caught him on the radio, but actually sat down and listened to what this man was doing with his voice. And my immediate reaction was, damn, this man can really sing. Like, he's got the kind of voice that belongs in somebody's church on Sunday morning leading the congregation in worship. But here he is talking about regulators and chronic and bodies dropping and women and all the dark, complicated, messy parts of street life. And somehow it still sounds like he's delivering a sermon. It still sounds holy, even when the content is anything but sacred. And now I'm wondering if what I was hearing wasn't just talent. It was the sound of someone who grew up at the crossroads, not just geographically, but spiritually caught between the sacred and the profane, the holy and the street, the church and the corner. You have to understand the context of what Nate Dogg was doing, because this wasn't normal. This wasn't how things were supposed to work. This man literally grew up singing in church. He spent his formative years at Lifeline Baptist Church in Clarksdale, Mississippi, where his father was a pastor and his mother led the choir, so he had Sunday morning service baked into every single note that came out of his throat. That church-trained gospel tone that comes from years of testifying and praising and lifting your voice up to God. But then he moved to Long Beach, California in his mid-teens. And what was he using this sacred gift for? He was singing about life on the streets, about drug dealers and gang members and violence and sex and all the things that most church folks would be praying you'd get delivered from. But when those words came through Nate's vocal cords, they didn't sound profane. They sounded like truth. They sounded like someone bearing witness to the reality of where he came from. The contradiction shouldn't have worked if you broke it down on paper. Holy voice plus unholy content should have been a disaster. Should have sounded fake or forced or disrespectful to everything that voice represented. But it worked so perfectly that after a while you stopped questioning it and just let it wash over you like some kind of baptism in dirty water. And now that I've been thinking about music and artistry for years, and especially about where Nate came from, I can see exactly what made it genius. He wasn't trying to clean up the street stories he was showing us. that even the darkest, most complicated parts of human experience deserve to be sung about with dignity and soul. He was taking that sacred sound and bringing it down into the mud, not to mock the sacred, but to show us that maybe the sacred was already there in the struggle, in the pain, in the realness of trying to survive and find meaning in places where hope is hard to come by. And here's where it gets deep, where it gets almost supernatural, because Robert Johnson's legend isn't just about selling your soul for musical ability. It is about the idea that some voices, some talents are so otherworldly, so perfect for their purpose, that they can't be explained by normal human development. And when you listen to Nate Dogg, when you really listen to what he was able to do with his voice, it's almost like he made his own kind of deal, not with the devil, but with something else. Some force that let him take the most sacred sound in American music, the sound of black gospel, the sound of Sunday morning praise and worship, and use it to sanctify the streets, to make gang stories sound like hymns, to make drug songs sound like testimonies. He created what people now call gangsta soul, which became its own whole genre, but at the time nobody had a name for what he was doing because nobody had ever done it before. Robert Johnson bent the guitar to sound like voices crying. Nate bent his voice to sound like a hook you'd die for. And once he opened that door, once he showed people that you could take a church voice and use it to tell street stories without losing the power of either one, everybody else started walking through that same doorway. And now you can hear his influence in every hook that tries to make something dirty sound beautiful, every singer who brings soul and spirituality to rap music, every artist who understands that you don't have to choose between being sacred and being real. But here's where the story gets tragic, and this is what that reel was really trying to tell us. Genius comes with a cost, especially when the industry doesn't know how to handle what you're offering, and maybe especially when your genius comes from walking that line between the holy and the unholy. Nate Dogg released 3 solo albums, but nobody was checking for those albums the same way they were checking for his features. Nobody was sitting with his complete artistic vision, the way they were memorizing his hooks on other people's records. And somewhere along the way, that started wearing on his soul, because he had things to say. He had stories to tell. He had a complete artistic vision that went way beyond just being the guy who made your chorus memorable, but the industry, and frankly the fans, had already decided what they wanted from him. So he made a business decision that was probably also an emotional survival decision. He said, you know what, if all you want is the hook, if all you care about is that 16 bars of Nate Dogg magic, then here's my price, pay me, and that's all you get. No more trying to build something deeper, no more hoping you'll listen to the album cuts, no more fighting for respect as a complete artist. Just give me my money for the hook and I'm out. And it was smart business, but it was also heartbreaking, because what it really meant was the game had told him loud and clear, we don't want your voice, we want your function. We don't want Nate Dogg, the human being, with thoughts and feelings and stories to tell. We want Nate Dogg, the brand name, the reliable hook generator, the guy who can make any song sound soulful without us having to think too hard about what that soul actually represents. The proof was in the numbers. Warren G was largely unknown when he released Regulate, but that song went to number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100, and it's still his most well-known record, arguably because of Nate Dogg's contributions. And you can see the same pattern on track after track, and that became the template for his entire career. Make other people's songs better, make other people's careers, but somehow never quite get the recognition as a complete artist in his own right. And maybe that's the real devil's bargain. Maybe that's the price he paid, not his soul, but his artistic identity, traded away 16 bars at a time. And the thing that really gets to me is you had never heard singing like that before him. Not in hip-hop, not anywhere. This man took gospel music that he learned performing in church choirs in the same town where Robert Johnson supposedly made his legendary deal, and created something entirely new. But because it was so unique, because it didn't fit neatly into any existing category, the industry just used them for parts instead of trying to understand and market the whole. And that's a tragedy, because what he was doing was revolutionary. He was the first person to bring that pure, sanctified sound into rap music and make it work, make it feel authentic, make it sound like prayer, even when he was talking about things that would make your grandmother clutch her pearls. R. Kelly might have been singing dirty, but R. Kelly wasn't street R. Kelly was bedroom music, smooth and seductive, but not hard, not raw, not speaking to the experience of growing up in the hood. Nate was corner music and church music and soul music all wrapped up in one voice, and nobody knew what to do with that level of complexity, so they just took the parts they could understand and used and ignored the rest. And now, decades later, you can hear that Nate Dogg DNA in almost everything. Hooks that cuss and croon, and confess hooks that sound like prayers. Even when they're talking about sins, that's his fingerprint, stamped on multiple generations of artists who probably don't even realize they're borrowing from his blueprint every time they try to make something raw sound beautiful. But here's the question that's been eating at me ever since I saw that reel and started thinking about Clarksdale and Crossroads and the price of genius. Did we ever really listen, not to the hooks that made the songs memorable, not to the features that made other artists' records better, but to him, to Nate Dogg, the complete person, to the full songs he was trying to make, to the albums he poured his heart into, to what he was trying to say when he wasn't just providing that one line of salvation for somebody else's vision. Warren G said that toward the end of his life, Nate was actually getting back into gospel music. He was done with the street content. He was moving toward the church side, and I can't help but wonder what we missed, what kind of music he would have made if we had supported his artistic evolution instead of just wanting him to stay frozen as the hook guy forever. Maybe he was trying to find his way back to the church side of those crossroads. Maybe he was trying to reclaim the sacred parts of his gift. And I have to be honest with myself here, because watching that reel made me realize I was part of the problem. I was part of the pattern that reduced this genius to his most marketable parts. I loved that voice. I quoted those hooks. I sang along to every feature, but I never really dug deeper into what he was building as a solo artist. I never gave his albums the same attention I gave to the albums he was featured on. And that's on me. That's on all of us who took the gift without honoring the giver, who loved the function without respecting the human being, who created something we had never heard before and probably won't hear again. Nate Dogg suffered multiple strokes starting in 2007 and passed away in 2011 at just 41 years old. And when he died, the tributes poured in, everyone talking about his legendary hooks, his incredible voice, his contributions to hip-hop. But I wonder how many of those tributes mentioned his solo work, how many people went back and listened to those albums he put his heart into, how many people tried to understand the complete artistic vision of a man who gave so much of himself to other people's dreams that he eventually stopped believing anyone cared about his own. And I wonder if in those final years, if he ever thought back to Clarksdale, to those church services, to his father's sermons, to his mother, leading the choir to that place where the sacred and the profane have always lived side by side, to those crossroads where maybe everything began. That's why I had to say this today, because genius isn't always the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes genius is the voice that grows up at the crossroads between sacred and street, between Sunday morning and Saturday night. Sometimes genius is the voice that can make you believe in God even when it's singing about sin. And when we reduce artists to their most useful parts, we rob ourselves of the full experience of what they were trying to give us, and we rob them of the respect they deserved as complete human beings, not just as functions in someone else's success story. Maybe Nate Dogg did make a deal at those crossroads, but it wasn't with the devil, it was with us, and we didn't hold up our end of the bargain. Thank you for listening to This Is Genius. And until next time, remember that some voices are born at crossroads where the holy meets the raw. And those voices deserve to be heard completely, not just when it's convenient for our playlists.